As someone whose cinematographic background is about as shallow as a rain puddle, there are a lot of references that simply fly right over my head. This is especially true for American classics. Save for the mainstream action movie flicks that the land of the free seems hell-bent on importing over to Europe, I haven't had much exposure to iconic burger cinema. This is why I was more than a bit confused when I started seeing a certain character popping out everywhere on YouTube. He was in thumbnails, memes, analysis videos. I knew the actor behind the face, for I had seen him in other movies before, but I was stumped as far as this specific role goes. I only knew two things. The part he plays in this story had a massive impact on internet culture, and the vast majority of the individuals who resonated with it and felt it the most durably were males. So why are men obsessed with American Psycho? Let's talk about it. The movie opens in a restaurant, while the opulent scenery of sophisticated dishes is preceded by a sordid montage of what appears to be a choreographed murder, which is actually kitchen prep work. This sets the tone for the rest of the movie. Even though the surface level of the environment and characters which we'll be following is pristine, the aristocratic surface soon gives way to the bloodbath underneath. In that, the movie is already a critique of higher society, the most civilized of spheres and also the most ruthless. But before looking at the movie's broader themes, we have to dissect its main actor, Patrick Bateman. Our first impression of him is that of a poised, mild-mannered man who just so happens to take part in the cynical world of finances. He goes out of his way to call out a coworker on his anti-Semitic remarks, and for a second there, you might start to believe that we're dealing with a stand-up guy.
Cool it with the anti-Semitic remarks.
This illusion is quickly shadowed by the nightclub scene, in which Patrick threatens to kill a woman and play with her blood. The manner in which this occurs is key, because it gives us a lot of information about his personality. Bateman's anger trigger being the fact that the barmaid didn't seem particularly impressed by his attire, or seduced by his charm. Failure to elicit a positive response, especially in the opposite sex, can be a cause for deep frustration, which is clearly the case here, as it immediately transforms into bloodlust. Patrick's relationship with women will be of great interest to us, because it mimics the contemporary male sexuality crisis, so expect the essay to frequently loop back around to that theme. Interestingly, in this specific occurrence, Bateman waited for the barmaid to turn around before having his outburst, offering us another key component of his character. Regardless of his rage, saving face is of the utmost importance to him, proving that other people's opinion play a key role in his life. A man with a mask. This would be an apt, albeit simplistic description of Patrick Bateman. On the outside, he is everything that a man could wish to be. Handsome, muscular, rich. His life is strictly regimented, and he puts an inordinate amount of time and effort into his appearance, to the point of vanity. He is a being entirely possessed by outside appearances, with a lavish lifestyle beyond anything that the ordinary man could relate to. And yet, he has become an icon of modern masculinity, a consecration made visible by his omnipresence in alpha male memes on social media. Why? Well, I think it is because he is what society tells men they need to become in order to be deemed successful. But if you look closely at the characteristics I listed, they remain surface level, showing that our understanding of masculinity relies almost entirely on external characteristics. with practices such as fitness or self-improvement being reduced to materialistic means, without a hint of deeper spirituality. With that interpretation in mind, the infamous morning routine scene takes on a whole new meaning. What we're witnessing is not the everyday schedule of a well-balanced man. Instead, it is the desperate scramble of a guy who has to reapply a facsimile of identity to his flesh in order to be functional, and therefore accepted. This is his mask, and here is where we can relate to him. In order to exist in society, we all have to put up a front. That much is inevitable. However, the level of masquerade as of late has gotten intense, and many men feel like they have to be someone else in order to exist. At some point, our identity got hijacked. By looking at Patrick Bateman, we see what this late-stage crisis can create. Someone who is trying so hard to adhere to a specific image that underneath it, he is no longer human.
There is an idea of a Patrick Bateman, some kind of abstraction, but there is no real me, only an entity, something illusory.
Of course, as we'll get to see later, the creature underneath the Bateman mask was never human to begin with. Or rather, it was never conformed to the expectations of society. But even though the murderous portion differ, the inability of freely expressing the self remains the same. As a result, connections with others become impossible, and the mask that once served to civilize human interactions now render them cold and sterile. In that sense, Patrick doesn't only represent a man, he is the very allegory of the modern society in which we live. His place of work is also an extension of that theme. The only thing people remark on as they're walking the aisle of this massive financial building is whatever expensive new possession they can spot on their peers. In this environment, sociopathic traits are a definitive evolutionary advantage, something that our protagonist demonstrates with his attitude and interactions. Wearing headphones in a public space is no innocent act. It translates a feeling of superiority, in that you clearly do not care what people have to say to you, while at the same time affecting a nonchalance of sorts. As if to say that all this scarcely matters to you. Of course, this is an act, as we will see with the business card scene. Everything Patrick Bateman does is play, participating in an effort to sculpt the mask. Only when he interacts with inferiors do his true colors shine through. For example, his conversation with his secretary, during which he outs himself as an unabashed sexist. And there's nothing she can do about it, because he is her superior. In this exchange, Jean, the clerk, is presented as enjoying the attention, with Patrick's attitude being framed as dominant and seductive. This short scene demonstrates the animality of male-female relationships. My reading is opposed to good taste, but explains why this character in particular has cemented himself in the minds of many as the archetype of the alpha Chad. The ability to talk freely to women without feeling self-conscious or precocious is exposed in full here, and for a lot of men, this liberty is one they simply do not experience. Hence, they live their fantasy of macho domination through the movie, a phenomenon that has become prevalent as of late. If in the past, male power fantasies served as blueprints to masculinity, it seems now that their modern equivalent, namely pop culture memes, only work as substitutes. This is incredibly meta, because it serves the exact same function in Patrick's case. He exorcises the lack of control he feels in everyday life by domineering those too weak to challenge him. It wouldn't be too far-fetched to paint the movie as sexist. After all, most of the female cast is either entirely vapid or submissive, far from the modern Hollywood archetype of the badass broad. The chicks here play second fiddle to the men, and only get screen time to serve as exposition for Bateman and the boys. Herein lies the genius of the film. It lampoons our modern understanding of romance, and presents matrimony in its most abject form. That of a purely materialistic system, where no love is present and each action is only motivated by personal gain. Patrick is hitched to a woman whose words are of so little consequences to him that he wears headphones when riding a cab with her, which she apparently doesn't seem to mind. He is happy to block her voice out, and she is content just babbling endlessly. He listens to a song about romance while she plans a wedding. The irony of beings whose only idea of love is a manufactured version of it that modernity sold them. Our current mating ethos exposed for all to see. Overall, these moments offer a true interrogation on the nature of men and women, with gender roles serving only as a painful reminder of the regressive nature of binary constructs. In American Psycho, the men are predatory assholes, and the women helpless dolts. As such, they serve as caricatures, both masculinity and femininity being reduced to their most basic and vulgar traits. At no point in this scenario are the intrinsic spiritual differences between the sexes mentioned, and that is because they do not matter. In a materialistic society, we are all the same, both genders united by consumerism. Ownership, a key component of relationships, is also put in question. Bateman seemingly not caring about his bird cheating on him with a coworker. A puzzling stance, as one would expect a chauvinist like him to be extremely jealous. A psychopathic reading of the situation reveals a simpler truth. He doesn't mind because it doesn't change his public image. In the same vein, he doesn't care if she discovers he's having an affair, because that too wouldn't damage his social standing. All his actions and words are for the eyes of others, as his sense of self-worth relies entirely on his ability to be accepted. This is made immediately evident by his affected looks and mannerisms, but most importantly by his political posturing. In public, Bateman is an outspoken social justice warrior, a champion of equal rights and defender of minorities and women. His tartuffery is plain for all to see, and even he must partly realize how phony this all sounds. But it doesn't matter. This is all for the sake of giving off a certain image.
We have to provide food and shelter for the homeless, and oppose racial discrimination and promote civil rights, while also promoting equal rights for women. We have to encourage a return to traditional moral values. Most importantly, we have to promote general social concern, and less materialism in young people.
I think we've all been there. We've all pretended to embrace ideas we didn't have or be someone we weren't, for the sake of scoring social brownie points. But when another man makes a grandiose spectacle of his generous soul, we learn in retrospect how fake and foolish the whole affair must have looked. And that's exactly what the dinner scene provides. The fact that Bateman would lecture others about traditional moral values perfectly underlines the hypocrisy of this modern culture of posturing that has become so trendy in the West. Something that the following shot confirms, as he can be seen withdrawing hundreds of dollars only mere minutes after his sermon on materialism. At this point of the movie, Patrick has yet to commit a crime, and yet we already know he's a psycho, because we've had access to his inner monologue, but mostly because the way he navigates his life is indicative of dysfunction. A mask is only as efficient as the person who wears it. The issue for Patrick is that he's not a very good actor, and his negative emotions often overtake his ability to hide his true self. For the most part, this doesn't matter, because he only lets go around people who aren't important, but it prefaces a certain instability, as if he were only one bad day away from losing control. This speaks to the edge on which a lot of men nowadays seem perched on. Their true emotions constantly repressed by the need to fit in a society that has entirely demonized any outward expression of anger or distress. The result is a generation of overgrown boys whose poor anger management skills makes them potential ticking time bombs, as the only way to master an emotion is to experience it fully and regularly, something masks forbid. An inability to repress one's own rage in situations of social conflict is often found in psychopaths, who are much more prone to showcase outward displays of aggression, especially if it helps get them what they want. But it is also a masculine trait, men typically being the confronting sex. Every form of antisocial personality disorder are androgenic qualities taken to the extreme, which explains why males are overrepresented in this population. Patrick, who wants nothing more than to fit in, tries his hardest to repress these tendencies in order to preserve his social life, something we all have to do. However, this doesn't include people he doesn't care about, who get to see him for what he truly is, an emotionless manipulator who only sees people as accessories. Every human is a means to an end, speaking again to the heartless depiction of interpersonal relationship that the movie portrays. It seems as if the social pact, which was once apparently based on common core values and civilizational trust, is now nothing more than a monetary contract, with sensualism now at the core of every relationship. In this aromantic society, the only thrills to be chased are a lot of instantaneous gratification, a penchant demonstrated by Patrick and his constant consumption of pornographic images. Overstimulation runs rampant in a world that has done away with spirituality, the only highs of the soul now being jolts of pleasure. Patrick at least has the excuse of having been born without one, but each of his attempts at staying in a constant state of excitement is not just another way for the script to remind us of his diagnosis. There are also coping mechanisms we're guilty of and that keep us distracted from our screaming conscience. His porn addiction speaks to Patrick's inability to control his sexual urges, and the distorted image he has of women, something I'll detail later on. But we can also mention his tendency to listen to music in all situations, both habits serving to keep his dopamine levels high. By making these traits a key part of his dysfunctional behavior, American Psycho forces us to reconsider these activities that modern men had started to normalize, but that now appear entirely deranged through Bateman. Another great example of that frame shifting is the business card bit, which gives us an inside look at group social dynamics amongst men in a post-masculinity world. To begin with, we once more get to witness Patrick's attitude towards those he considers to be inferior. He only gives others attention if they can provide him with positive reinforcement, otherwise he ignores them altogether, even refusing to make eye contact. This unwillingness to associate with men that don't immediately benefit our social standing or sense of self-worth is incredibly prevalent in male circles, and is especially observable amongst teenagers, who through puberty experience the purest form of animality. Even as adults, we have a tendency to shun those that desperately try to get our attention, as we immediately perceive them as weak. Paradoxically, This is also a sign of weakness, as someone like Patrick, who desperately tries to appear too cool for school, is also a slut for affirmation, and is therefore just as fragile and needy. Members of a dominance hierarchy are still all subjected to the pyramid, even if they stand at its top. This is the underlying message of this iconic scene. Any and all modern social structures have the tendency to wash out the colors of the self, an anomaly when you consider that cohesive groups were originally formed of varying personality types. As time went by, the growing size and complexity of such organizations led to a uniformization of profiles, where individual quirks were slowly replaced by group identities to facilitate cooperation. At Patrick's firm, everyone looks the same, wears the same suits, with the same ridiculous ties, has the same haircut, and wears the same glasses. This is to the point that members of the firm can't readily identify one another. At the start of the movie, we got a segment where the boys were looking for Paul Allen, but didn't seem able to tell exactly where he was. This confusion extends to this scene, where Bateman is mistaken for another man by that same Paul. Before looking at what it means for Patrick, let's observe the scene as a whole, as I believe it to be a pastiche of the human condition. The men in that room have no personality to speak of, because like him, they desperately try to fit in. In a sense, their individuality has been replaced by pseudo-religious behavior, while the god they worship is money, and the robes they don are whatever ridiculously expensive attire they can put their hands on. If you think back to the everyday man, this isn't too far from reality. The cult of the self and rampant individualism that has overtaken the West has had a leveling effect on males as a whole, leaving us with an identity crisis that has opened the door to placebos of sorts, which the business card represents. This item is supposed to be an extension of the self, not a replacement for it. And yet this is what it has become. The card is an allegory of material possession. Patrick and the guys judge each other's worth based on something as stupid as a piece of paper, which is exactly what we do on a daily basis, as petty properties have replaced innate values. What makes this situation even more absurd is the fact that to the naked eye, there is literally no differences between the cards. Just like there is no difference between the humans that own them, or the exorbitant restaurants these guys go to. It's all just for status' sake. Whatever vices the 1% cultivates, just a magnified version of our own, made all the more blatant by the distance that separates us from them, which allows for the cruel realization to set in. We are just as ridiculous as these types, but not quite as far gone. This ego race fueled by materialism has replaced real masculinity, and we have all become slaves to others' opinions.
Impressive. Very nice. Let's see Paul Allen's card. Look at that subtle off-white coloring. The tasteful thickness of it. Oh my god. It even has a watermark.
Modern men have no identity to speak of, save for the items they can buy, making the image we project to the world our true self, as one who wears too long a mask eventually becomes it. This is why Patrick didn't mind getting mistaken for someone else, because there is nothing of substance to his existence. What's more interesting is that he wouldn't take the time to correct this apparently silly misunderstanding. To me, this is for two reasons. One, it's a way for the story to double down on the general feeling of confusion installed by the constant mixing and mashing of names. Patronyms are of great importance within social settings, because they allow for instant identification between members. What looks like just a nagging attempt from Poe could very well be the symptom of a general inability to distinguish humans from one another, which would speak to the unraveling of this modern world under the weight of uniformity. The second reason has once again to do with the mask. Here, correcting Alan would equate with losing face in the eyes of Patrick, who at all times wants to appear in control. In the previous segment, he was seen lying about the name of a restaurant to a drugged-up woman who had no grasp on reality. Again, it shows that he doesn't really care what people think of him. Rather, he obsesses over the way their opinion impacts his own self-view. In short, he's deathly afraid of ridicule, a behavioral trait that most humans share. Patrick's ego is fragile, to the point that not having the fanciest card is enough to shake his reality. Again, this is highly exaggerated, but speaks to how warped modern priorities have gotten. We now put immense stock in things that shouldn't matter, but that social neuroticism has turned focal. What appears like a lighthearted and comedic scene is actually the pivot point of the story, and what gave it its name. In the movie, there isn't just one American Psycho. Every single character demonstrates varying levels of psychopathy, just like every single human who exists in modern society is host to one or several dysfunctions. It's no mystery why this bit precedes Patrick's first murder on screen. When relationships between humans get stunted to the point that they can be summed up entirely by petty dick measuring contests, the next natural step is the total regression of civilization into barbarous acts. Now we're getting into the bloodiest part of the movie, which for many sums up the essence of the film. This is where I start peering under the veil of the script, and take the previously discussed themes to a whole new level, in an attempt to explain why what looks like a pseudo-intellectual slasher flick is actually an incredibly well-hidden meta-critique of modernity. In order to accompany me beyond the mirror, I want you to refrain from any sensationalist interpretation of gore, because doing so would prevent you from understanding the core message of American Psycho. To me, Bateman's murders go beyond their aesthetic statement. What matters is not the shock value associated with them, but the motivations that push Patrick towards committing these social transgressions, and the allegorical message that they convey. His killing of the homeless man, for example, is due entirely to the disgruntlement felt during the business card fiasco, and the sentiment of inferiority that accompanies it. Belittling the vagrant is a mean for him to exercise his supremacy, which reveals once again that most of his self-worth is derived from his position in the firm. His insistence that the man just get a job, the proof that he thinks it to be the fix to every problem on Earth, including a lack of identity. This portion of the movie is incredibly hard to watch, because it reflects the common attitude that society holds towards the homeless. That they're just lazy bodies with a negative attitude that need to pull themselves by the bootstraps. In killing the vagabond, Bateman commits a non-act. He takes the life of someone who was already dead in the eyes of society, and who was therefore no longer included in the social pact. The killing of Paul is of a different and more personal ilk. While the homeless man just served as an outlet for his frustrations, Alan was directly responsible for them, as someone that Patrick looks up to and envies enormously, but who continuously denies him the gratification he requires. Alan's death represents the destruction of a system that oppresses the individual to the point of radical rebellion, effectively painting our current society as plotting its own annihilation. We've been wearing the mask because we were sold the idea that it was needed to keep society together. But if humanity has degraded to the point that we're not really ourselves anymore, what's the point in pretending? This is the dangerous message that American Psycho and its portrayal of modernity conveys. The idea that we are past the point of no return and have entered post-modernity, where all our social arrangements have degenerated to the point of becoming harmful. The movie is named American Psycho for a reason. It is the environment that causes the condition. For an entire generation of men, the temptation to take off the mask and turn their back on social conventions is growing, and movies like this one exist as an outlet for these transgressive desires, with Patrick becoming a comfort character. This is more than a little concerning, considering the man is a literal serial killer. But again, let us refrain from judgments of value based on sensationalist takes. Men everywhere like the figure of Bateman, not because they wish to burn society to a crisp or because they hate women, but on the account of the demons that the spectacle of Patrick's insanity helps them exorcise. American Psycho has become a safety valve for the civilizational anxiety of many, a cathartic exercise for modern men everywhere. Characters in American Psycho have had dozens of occasions to catch Bateman red-handed, and they always failed, because their perception of the world kept them blind and vulnerable. The fact that they wouldn't realize what was going to happen, even with all the available cues, is a subtle wink to the fact that this society of pretenses has made us wholly incapable of realizing what is and isn't real. Not only is Alan not able to recognize Bateman, he also fails to anticipate his own death. Modernity has rendered humans oblivious to the damages it causes, and even with the reality of the situation staring us in the face, we're simply not able to pinpoint the origin of our misery. Just like characters in American Psycho are blind to the killer amongst them, who strikes indiscriminately. This assassin isn't particularly discreet or cunning. He gets by thanks to our foolishness. From that, it'd be easy to interpret the entire movie as happening inside of Patrick's head. After all, the business card scene could just be a figment of his imagination, and the carbon copy similarities between all the actors just a sign of his psychopathy. His lack of empathy making him wholly unable to differentiate between individuals. Every murder on screen could also be part of his revenge fantasy, meaning they probably have never happened. Patrick himself being nothing more than an allegorical device used by the movie to move the plot along. But for what goal? Simply trying to paint the events of the story as fallacious would be missing the point. Because as I've said, what matters isn't whether or not they happened, but the significance they convey. After all, you're watching a movie. None of it is real. Patrick's murders are also never discovered. Another fact that could mean they never happened, but that I interpret as a parable of the willful ignorance that surrounds male violence. Times and times again, whenever men commit barbarous acts, we immediately jump to the gore and ignore the symbol. In doing so, we stay entirely blind to the reasons that explain the bloodshed and remain unprepared for its inevitable reoccurrence. Bateman is horrible at covering his tracks, and his attitude betrays him entirely during his discussions with the detective. Just like the global misery and angst of man is plain for all to see. And yet, nothing happens. Even bringing up this topic makes some people uncomfortable, as if they were trying to keep an old, disheveled beast from escaping the basement. The issue is that the creature is already out, and playing dumb isn't going to stop it from rampaging around, hurting both men and women in its frenzy. The inordinate amount of time and effort the movie spends presenting Patrick's relationships with the opposite sex furthers this depiction of the monster unleashed. As said previously, he only sees women as objects, whom he gets to mold to his satisfaction. Throughout the movie, we've seen him choose dishes for them, select their attires, dictate the way their bodies should look, and even change their names. Which also speaks to the fact that women have no identity either, and are interchangeable. In return, he expects them to be impressed by his job and possessions. He is stuck in a purely materialistic understanding of heterosexual companionship. This is what makes every interaction he has with a female so uncomfortable. It feels like he's talking to a table, because he is. As such, he completely misses out on what makes women special and worthy of love, explaining why he has no difficulties treating them the way he does. Thankfully, most guys don't go that far, but the way they interact with the object of their desire is eerily similar to it. Their attraction to the female body colored by resentment, making Bateman's manners a mirror of our grotesque understanding of women. Patrick, in the way he treats women, is the perfect allegory of the modern bachelor. He only cares about their bodies and what pleasure he can derive from it, explaining why he doesn't mind when his partner falls asleep at the dinner table, because he never cared about her conversation to begin with. Females are reduced to sentient blow-up dolls that exist solely to stimulate and fulfill the libidos of men. Bateman treating his fiancée again as if she were just another one of his possessions, insisting for example that she gets breast implants as a Christmas gift to him. Women are nothing but plastic vaginas with legs. This mindset is now the dominating one amongst young males in the West, explaining why they would be able to relate to Patrick so extensively. I only wonder whether or not they realize the tragedy of their situation. You can't cherish what you don't understand. Men, who are always historically the protectors of women, have also always been their number one killer. However, it seems that the equilibrium has shifted. In the movie, there is no one to protect the girls. They are always depicted as lost, with an almost childlike look on their face, and their female instinct, which should at all times keep them safe, appears entirely dormant. Between the model that tells Patrick he has a sweet vibe, Jean who appears oblivious to his murder attempt, and the prostitute that follows him home after having already been tortured once, they appear as lost as the males. The only difference is that they are the prey in this scenario. I believe it to be no mistake that the script would have Patrick recall his escapade with two prostitutes. Porn plays an integral role in the movie, as it does in the destruction of masculinity. In both cases, it participates in the objectification of the female body, and the annihilation of any semblance of respect that a male could have for it. Bateman's ridiculous antics during sex, although funny at first, are a satire of a self-obsessed understanding of love-making, the hedonistic interpretation of intercourse centered entirely on gratification. This debased but sadly ever-present take on intimacy stems from the schizophrenic nature of modern male-female relationships. This asynchronism of the sexes used to be the strength of heterosexual relationships, but has become a most fatal flaw due to the general confusion brought forth by modern societies. As a result, men are left estranged from women, the flower of romance severed from the roots of desire, which ultimately rots and turns into bitterness. These unchecked and contradicting portions quarter Bateman and leave him unstable. You will have noticed that his murders are always somewhat premeditated, but never in cold blood. This is because he only commits crimes of passion. Far from the hyper-intellectual stereotype of the serial killer, he is a creature of emotions. In that, and despite, or maybe because, of his psychopathy, he is very similar to the average man. The difference is that he has embraced his abnormality and lets it out sporadically. He is the acme of hypermasculinity, the result of a male driven entirely by his instincts without any empathy. This archetype is immediately fascinating in the eyes of a generation that has grown without any semblance of masculine role models. But like moths drawn to a flame, it's not for the right reasons. Patrick, in the simplest term, is a liar. He fabricates a life for himself that varies depending on the person he is trying to impress. And because everyone else around him does the same, no one really knows what's true and what's not anymore. Just looking at the investigation around Paul Allen's disappearance shows how absurd the identity crisis the characters go through has gotten. No one is able to recognize each other's faces, no one remembers each other's names, and no one can tell exactly where they went and when. Considering how important common memories are for the formation of a cohesive society, it's no wonder why this depiction of modernity would be such a hit amongst young men, who no doubt have felt the same unease.
No. Where were you?
Where was Marcus?
He wasn't with Paul Allen.
Who was he with?
He was at Atlantis.
With?
Craig McDermott, Frederick Dibble, Harry Newman, George Butner, and you.
Interestingly, that same message is as valuable for women, who have suffered from it just as much, if not more than men, as the movie perfectly portrays with the several unfortunate souls that had the misfortune of spending a night with Mr. Bateman. During the most spectacular bloodfest American Psycho has to offer, we are exposed to the horrors of an apartment filled to the brim with Patrick's female victims. The deliberate way in which the bodies are arranged and the manner in which these women were lured in all point to something more intense than simple shock value. The symbolic here is clear. Attracted by money and the promise of a night of pleasure, modern woman leads herself into a death trap. The only one that escaped Patrick's grasp was Jean, and it is because she made a show of modesty that kept her out of harm's way. For the rest, all the ones that accepted the money, drugs, or sexual gratification were eventually killed by Patrick. The prostitute, who was drawn in against her best sense by a man whom she knew was evil, ends up trying to escape an apartment that symbolizes the realm of promiscuity, in which a bachelor stashes the corpses of all the women he had sex with. In reaching the hallway, she screams and bangs on doors, but no one answers. This is because the modern world has left women entirely without protection, at the mercy of their desires. The next scene includes Patrick drawing a sketch of the killing on a table, next to his fiancée who still insists on marrying him, doubling down on female willful ignorance and the suicide of femininity. After that, the movie spirals entirely into madness, with Patrick literally trying to feed a stray cat to an ATM because the machine ordered him to, and killing an old woman with no motives whatsoever. I believe that this seemingly absurd development isn't so absurd after all. It signifies the death of meaning. Modernity, as we have seen, is the realm of the absurd, where the rules don't make sense and people are entirely lost to who they are and what they're supposed to do. Bateman, who is at the forefront of societal insanity, is really an enunciator of it. He keeps telling people that he is going insane and that he will hurt others, but no one listens. Just like modernity has been sending us non-stop signals that its impact on human society is not doing us any good, but we don't hear. Even when it calls us on the phone to tell us about all the people it killed, like Patrick did to his lawyer, we turn a blind eye. This role played by Christian Bale is not only the portrayal of a man, it is the portrayal of an entire epic. Patrick Bateman represents modern society itself, his interactions with other characters being symptoms of the time, with him being the disease. From what the end of the movie tells us, he very well might not even exist. This plot twist that should render the entire movie senseless actually opens the door to an epiphany. Something that Patrick himself states at the start of the movie. There is no real me, only an idea.
But that's simply not possible. And I don't find this funny anymore.
It never was supposed to be. Why isn't it possible?
It's just not.
Why not, you stupid bastard?
Because I had dinner with Paul Allen twice in London. Just 10 days ago.
No, you didn't.
Now, if you'll excuse me.
Patrick Bateman is the spirit of modernity, the evil entity that makes the world go mad. In American Psycho, there is no one psycho. Everyone has entirely lost touch with reality. The character of Patrick is the reflector that reveals everyone for who they are, pointed directly at the viewer, at men, at women, at us.
He presents himself as this harmless old codger, but inside.
But inside doesn't matter. My pain is constant and sharp, and I do not hope for a better world for anyone. In fact, I want my pain to be inflicted on others. I want no one to escape. But even after admitting this, there is no catharsis. My punishment continues to elude me, and I gain no deeper knowledge of myself. No new knowledge can be extracted from my telling. This confession has meant nothing.